So welcome to the fifth lecture in our Works That Shape the World public lecture series in 2022. This year, our focus is on religion. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people that we're speaking from here at the ANU in Canberra, and pay respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, past and present. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Rehan Ismail is a senior lecturer at the ANU's Center for Arab and Islamic Studies and the co-recipient of the 2018 Max Crawford Medal awarded by the Australian Academy for the Humanities. Rehan is the author of two books, Saudi Clerics and Shia Islam, published by Oxford University Press in 2016, and Rethinking Salafism, the transnational networks of Salafi ulama in Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, also published by Oxford University Press just last year. So this evening, Rehan will be speaking about that very topic on Salafism, and I'm happy to hand over to you, Rehan.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Ibrahim, and thank you so much for having me on board. I'm really excited because I'm going to be able to discuss the book and the findings of the book as well. So thank you again, Ibrahim. I just want to say that this talk is actually based on some of the findings of my book, as you said, which was published last year in October. So I'm hoping to look at 4 issues in this presentation. And the first issue that I would like to look at, so there are basically 4 parts of this talk. So the first issue, or the first part of this talk, I'll like to examine Salafism and its origins. And then the second part, I would like to discuss the Salafi typology put forward by scholars on Salafism. And this typology has actually shaped the literature on Salafism. The third is to examine the transnational networks of Salafi clerics in 3 countries. And I will discuss why these countries are important. And finally, I will use Sunni-Shia relations to understand the transnational networks of clerics and reassess the existing Salafi typology that we'll be discussing earlier. So we will be looking at the Shia question as a case study. It's actually one of the chapters in the book. In the book, I also examine the issues of extremism, political Islam, social liberalization, and conservatism within the Salafi movement. But I think I'm not going to be able to cover everything. So this book will just look, or this talk will just look at the Shia question, but more than happy to discuss the other issues as well in the Q&A. When we look at Salafism, Salafism respects religious authority, and religious knowledge is paramount. This explains why Salafi clerics or men of religion are considered as important. They are the leaders of the Salafi movement. And my research looks at the ulama, or men of religion, or clerics. I use clerics and ulama interchangeably because they are very influential in the Middle East and beyond. So Salafism is often blamed for providing the theological foundations for violent extremism. And Salafi creed and jurisprudence are often accused of rigidity, promoting social conservatism, and adhering to uncompromising attitudes towards those who fail to subscribe to authentic Islam, according to the Salafis. And the term Salafis derives from Salaf as-Salih, which means pious ancestors. So that's where the term comes from. And it refers to the first 3 generations of Muslims. And Salafism holds that the pious ancestors are to be emulated, as they were the closest to the Prophet and they belong to the golden age of Islam. And once the Prophet's immediate companions had died, the 2nd generation of Muslims inherited their knowledge of the faith. So they were considered as the preservers of the authentic tradition and the followers of the first generation of Muslims. So they're the first generation of Muslims. So by the 750 CE, when most of them had died, the 3rd generation of Muslims, identified as the followers of the followers. So they became the reliable sources for the authentic way of living as a Muslim. So if you look at that, Salaf al-Salih, pious ancestors, first 3 generations of Muslims, second generation of Muslims, then the third generation of Muslims. When we understand Salafism, the characteristics, or these characteristics act as markers to determine one's commitment to following a Salaf al-Salih. And as you can see on the slides, as pointed out by Bernard Haikal, a scholar who works on Salafism, a Salafi is immediately recognizable to others through distinctive dress, social and religious habits, prayer postures, and the content and form of his speech. So for example, although not universally, Salafis treat it as obligatory for men to keep their beards and for women to cover their faces. Not all Salafis adhere to these ideals, by the way, but the overwhelming majority of Salafis would require men to keep their beards and women to cover their faces. And Salafis emphasize the importance of Arabic language, which in their view brings them closer to divine sources. And this extends as far as practicing classical Arabic and valuing oratory perfection. Most Salafi clerics, in fact, ridicule those who speak in colloquial modern Arabic. So if you speak Egyptian Arabic, you're not authentic enough. So Salafis feel obligated by their commitment to the oneness of God to combat non-belief. So this is really an essential element of Salafi ideology, and particularly Salafi theology. And especially practices, they condemn practices that amount to shirk, which means deifying other than Allah, so associating with other beings with God. So the Salafi creed speaks against shirk, deifying other than Allah, in the strongest terms. So one of the prominent figures within the Salafi tradition is Ibn Taymiyyah. He was a prolific 12th century scholar. He denounced shirk in a number of publications. He focused his criticism on movements, various movements, including the Shia, those who practice independent reasoning, particularly philosophers of his time. So he denounced their thoughts in defense of Salafi orthodoxy. So Salafis, since his time, have cited his works widely and without scrutiny, and in doing so have tended to rely upon what they perceive as Ibn Taymiyyah's theological victory over his opponents. So one of the disciples of Ibn Taymiyyah is Ibn Abdul Wahhab, was Ibn Abdul Wahhab and his descendants. And Ibn Abdul Wahhab, was the founder of Saudi Arabia's main religious movement today. And he cites Ibn Taymiyyah in his publications as an authority. So we will look at the Saudi religious movement as well later. And Ibn Abdul Wahhab is the eponymous founder of the Wahhabi school of thought, very closely associated to Salafism. And the religious practices that Salafi theoreticians classify as innovations, including shrine visitations. They really have an issue with shrine visitations, praying to saints, and celebrations of particular religious events and holidays are condemned by the Salafis, and they classify these practices as bid'ah or innovations. And the often invoked justification for these clarifications comes from the Prophet's tradition. And as you can see there, it states that on the slides, every novelty is an innovation, every innovation is a misguidance, and every misguidance belongs to hellfire. So if you look at this Prophet's tradition or the Hadith, it is featured in nearly every Salafi publication concerning the issue of the oneness of God, or Tawheed, and continues to be cited in sermons, in publications, in religious rulings of clerics and theoreticians. So when we, Salafi theoreticians, particularly both classical and contemporary theoreticians, also quote a Quranic verse and Quranic verses in general, including the following from this chapter to support the foundation of Salafi theology. So come, I will recite what your Lord has prohibited to you. He commands that you not associate anything with him, and to parents, good treatment, and do not kill your children out of poverty. We will provide for you and them, and do not approach immoralities, what is apparent of them and what is concealed. So what this explains, this explains why Salafis are particularly hostile towards the Shia sect, as well as Sufism, which is Islamic mysticism. Sorry, do people have issues with the slides?
It's okay now.
Okay. So again, however, as we, when we look at Salafism, so I hope I'm changing the slides now. When we look at Salafism itself is not a monolith. So scholars who work on Salafism rely on other scholars' view or categorization of Salafism. So Wicht Horowitz was a prominent scholar who works on Salafism and terrorism studies. He classified Salafis or divided Salafis into 3 categories, and scholars who work on Salafism often rely on his typology. And many have challenged this typology, so people question the relevance and the validity of the typology. But despite the disagreement over the minor details of this categorization, the literature generally states that Salafis can be divided into 3 broad categories. So you have the Quietists, the activists, as well as the jihadis. So who are the Quietists? So the Quietists denounce any form of political activism, and they are always very supportive. They're very supportive of the state. So they demonstrate loyalty to the state. And within the Quietist tradition, you have the radical Quietists, for instance, who would do nothing but support the state, even if they view the state, as corrupt. You have the second category or the second trend, and that is the activist trend. Here we're referring to those who challenge the state but do not engage in violent activities. So the activist trend emerged following Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. And when you look at the history of the activist trend, scholars often argue that these activist trend rejected Saudi Arabia's decision to allow US troops to be based on Saudi soil. So that was the major issue for the activists. And they ultimately combine Muslim Brotherhood style activism with Salafi theology and jurisprudence, because the Muslim Brotherhood, even though they participate in the political process and so on, they do not adhere to Salafi interpretations of Islam. So they have a different theological interpretation of Islam and so on. But the Salafis really combine Muslim Brotherhood style activism with their theology and jurisprudence. And jihadi Salafis, that's a third trend. And those, when we talk about jihadi Salafis, you see so much has been written on jihadi Salafis. They're more popular than the other 2 trends. And here we're referring to those who promote violence to impose authentic Salafi ideals. And my research, I don't generally look at jihadi Salafis in my research, and even in this book that I publish, I don't really discuss jihadi Salafis very much, except how the Quietists and the activist clerics respond to jihadi Salafism, but not really discussing jihadi Salafism extensively. And I think because it has been done, you have so many scholars who have talked about jihadi Salafi networks, jihadi Salafi ideology, and so on. So I would strongly argue that this typology can only be used to understand the ulama or the clerics and their relations with the state. When it comes to other issues, including something that we'll be talking about later, including Sunni Shia relations, or even social liberalization or conservatism, this typology does not reflect the complex nature of Salafism or the transnational networks of Salafi clerics, which makes it very interesting. And I don't think people have actually looked at other issues when trying to assess the 3 broad trends, or the typology dividing Salafi clerics or Salafism in general. Often, they refer to state society, state clerical relations, but not really other issues. So before examining the Sunni Shia divide and sectarian issues as a case study for this talk, let's look at the nature of the transnational networks of Salafi clerics in 3 countries. So I've selected 3 countries, and there are reasons why I've selected these 3 countries in my research. So first, Saudi Arabia. And obviously, Saudi Arabia has long been an advocate of Salafism. Some scholars argue that Saudi Arabia is the face of modern Salafism. It is also responsible, or seen as responsible, for the spread of Salafi ideals throughout the Muslim world. And this is through, petrodollar and so on, the fact that the Saudi government sponsors various institutions in various parts of the Muslim world is seen as important, and especially classifying Saudi Arabia as the face of modern Salafism. So Egypt is the second country that I've decided to examine. And despite the fact that other religious traditions and movements in Egypt are more influential than Salafism, because in Egypt you have Al-Azhar as a separate religious tradition, then you have a political movement such as the Muslim Brotherhood, which is more dominant in Egypt, or was more dominant in Egypt in comparison to the Salafis. But having said that, Salafi ulama or Salafi clerics in Egypt are widely respected in the region, and that's why I've selected Egypt as another case study. And they are especially among their fellow Salafis, they're seen as highly credible, very popular, very prolific, very active in the region. They're also active in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And finally, I've also selected Kuwait, and similarly, Salafi ulama in Kuwait are active in the region, and they are known for their financial support for other Salafi movements in the region, including in Lebanon. So they fund Salafi groups in Lebanon, in Syria, in Indonesia, and Cambodia. So it can be argued that the selected countries are the centers of Salafism in the region and are very important for study of transnational Salafism. And Salafi ulama or clerics in these countries are transnational actors who promote collective solidarity, but they are also conditioned by their local and material circumstances. And part of the book discusses, so parts of the book discuss the importance of understanding local circumstances of these clerics as well when trying to understand the limits of transnational networks of the clerics. So when we look at the transnational networks of the clerics, I'm changing slides, so I hope that's working. Otherwise, please do let me know if the slides are not changing. So these transnational networks can be described as formal or informal, encompassing material and ideational ties between the Salafi clerics, developed through shared ideas, including theological and political views, traveling, various forms of communications, religious education, international conferences, and shared resources. So we're looking at formal and informal networks of clerics. Oh, seeing slide number 2.
Yeah, I'm seeing slide number 8. Can other people maybe let us know what they're seeing in the chat?
Yeah, so this is I'm at slide number 8 at the moment. So I'm looking at the emergence of the networks of clerics, looking at personal relations, establishment of religious institutions, particularly in Saudi Arabia, looking at education and religious funding.
So can other people see the smiling picture of King Abdulaziz?
Yes.
He's looking very happy. Malcolm and Liana are seeing.
Oh, cool.
Are seeing the king.
Seeing slide number. Okay, I think probably maybe it's working now.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Roz. We're going to record this and we're putting these all up on YouTube. So hopefully you can hear what Rehan is saying now, but then you can catch up with the slides. a little bit later. I'm not sure what's going on with your screen, but please continue, Rayhan.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. So the development of these networks can be attributed to Rashid Rida, a disciple of Muhammad Abdu, who was seen as very progressive. So he was the mufti or the grand sheikh of Al-Azhar in Egypt. And Rida was very different from his mentor. He gravitated towards Saudi Arabia and subsequently established relations with King Abdulaziz ibn Saud and his cohorts of ulama. So Abdulaziz ibn Saud was the founder of the modern Saudi state, which was established in 1932. And within Salafi circles, it is widely accepted that Rida directed Salafism away from the Islamic modernism espoused by Afghani and Abdu, his mentors, and brought it closer to the puritanical approaches of Islam championed by Wahhabism. So remember, we talked about Wahhabism, very rigid in their interpretations of Islam. They also adopt certain Salafi ideals, but they were known as Wahhabis before. It was Rashid Rida who bestowed the title Salafis to the Wahhabis. So the contrast between the two was stark, particularly Abdu and the Wahhabi movement. So Rashid Rida's engagement with Wahhabis brought the local and the global together in the development of modern Salafism. And although Rida was willing to collaborate with the Wahhabis, some have argued that he also tried to rehabilitate Wahhabism. In fact, in one case, criticizing a Wahhabi cleric he criticized a Wahhabi cleric for denouncing those who believe that the earth was not flat. So for him, he tried to rehabilitate the Wahhabism and its conservative interpretations of Islam. But it cannot be ignored that Wahhabism influenced the development of Salafism in Egypt, especially in the revival and promotion of the works of Ibn Taymiyyah as a source of reference for Salafis today. So if you look at Rashid Rida, for instance, he received a lot of support from the Saudi state. He received funding from Saudi Arabia, from Ibn Saud in particular, for advocating and defending the Saudi state and its religious tracts. So historically, this was a period where you're looking at the modern Saudi state. It needed a lot of religious legitimacy, obtain religious legitimacy domestically, but also wanted religious legitimacy externally. And Rashid Rida provided that religious legitimacy to the Saudi state. And Rida's most high-profile publication, Al-Manar, became a vehicle for Wahhabi sympathetic pieces to be published and circulated. So if you look at Al-Manar, Rashid Rida published Al-Manar, so it's one of his periodicals, and published the works of Saudi Salafis, or the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, as well as sympathetic pieces towards the Saudi state and Saudi clerics. And similarly, when you look at Ibn Saud himself, he sent his clerics to Egypt to distribute the works of Saudi clerics. In the 1950s, for example, Prince Naif, who was one of the members of the ruling family, visited Egypt and announced that the Salafi clerics in Egypt were Saudi Arabia's religious ambassadors. So when you look at these networks, so these early networks of Salafi ulama were fostered by shared, though negotiated, theological convictions, travel, material exchanges, and establishment of associations of similar religious persuasions. Egyptian Salafis, led by another cleric by the name of Hamid al-Fiqi, established an association in 1926. So when you look at members of this association, Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya, its members traveled back and forth from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, and some held high-profile positions in Saudi Arabia under the patronage of Ibn Saud. So if you look at some of the prominent figures of of this association who held high positions in Saudi Arabia. They include Abd al-Razzaq Hamza, who became a member of the board of senior clerics. Abu Samh, he became the third Imam of the Grand Mosque of Mecca, again, very prestigious position. Abd al-Razzaq Afifi became a member of the board of senior clerics, so the kingdom's most senior religious bureaucracy, and as a member of the Committee for Research and Scientific Studies, so the second highest body responsible for issuing religious rulings. And his success in Saudi Arabia demonstrates the transnational nature of these networks of Salafi clerics. What's also interesting, so we're looking at early networks, but here, Salafi clerics were also connecting through new media. By the early 2000s, new mediums of interaction had strengthened the connectivity of Salafi clerics through satellite television and the internet. So a number of Salafi satellite channels emerged. By the mid-2000s, these channels were widely watched across the region. So the Salafi clerics of Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia were at the forefront of this emerging trend, and they took advantage of it to foster relations and promote themselves. They are self-promoters. So they have YouTube accounts, they have Twitter accounts, they have Facebook accounts, and they connect and praise each other on YouTube channels and Salafi satellite channels and so on. They also appear on each other's show and demonstrate solidarity with each other. So we've looked at the transnational networks of clerics, and what's interesting as well is the Shia question here. So, we've examined the networks, we've looked at the history of the networks and how these clerics fostered transnational networks. When it comes to the Shia, despite the fact that Egypt in particular has an insignificant Shia population, they're estimated to be around 100,000 Shia in Egypt, and this is a country of 90 million people. The Egyptian Salafi ulama have long embraced the anti-Shia doctrine propagated by their Saudi counterparts. Rashid Rida, again known for his conservatism and close relations with the Saudi ruling family, became very sympathetic to the Saudi opinions of the Shia faith. So the works of Saudi clerics since the time of Ibn Abdul Wahhab were republished in his magazine Al-Manar. The magazine was established in 1928. So the Saudi anti-Shia condemnations were disseminated through Al-Manar, and Rashid Rida himself wrote on the subject, publishing a book titled As-Sunnah wa Shia or Al-Wahhabiyya wa Rafida. So that's the title of the book. The term Wahhabi was used to describe the Al Saud and the Najdi ulama before. It was not until the 1970s that the Saudi religious establishment adopted the Salafi mantle to dissociate themselves from being characterized as strictly the followers of Ibn Abdul Wahhab and nothing more. It was only in the 70s that when you look at publications or Saudi publications, they removed the term Wahhabi completely and they've replaced the term Wahhabi with Salafism or Salafi. And I think it was really an attempt for, an attempt by the Saudi state and its clerics to demonstrate that they belong to the Sunni fold rather than an extremist tribal sect as they were described before. And Rashid Rida himself assisted in that process. So Rashid Rida, a self-identified Salafi, began to bestow the label on the Wahhabis following his close relations with them, as I've mentioned earlier. And his narratives and analyses of this publication of Najdi publications or the Saudi publications clearly demonstrated his acceptance of the Saudi approach towards the Shia. So he defended Ibn Saud and his clerics as the preservers of Sunnis and the Muslims in general. He argues that Ibn Saud and his ulama or his clerics revived the Prophet's traditions while combating corrupt and innovative practices associated with Shia deviance. Some Shia scholars were frustrated with Rashid Rida because they thought he was more progressive than the Saudi Salafis. And Shia scholars themselves dedicated efforts to counter the rhetoric of Wahhabi ulama or Salafi ulama of Saudi Arabia and the legitimacy of Ibn Saud. So they questioned the legitimacy of the Saudi state and its clerics. A number of publications were published by a Shia magazine based in Lebanon. And in response, Rida and other Egyptian Salafi ulama defended Ibn Saud and his clerics. When we look at Salafism in Kuwait, I know I haven't really mentioned Kuwait very much, but Kuwait again is very interesting. Salafism in Kuwait developed in the 1960s, brought there, developed and maintained by Salafi ulama who settled in the country. So some would argue it's not really part of the Kuwaiti religious tradition initially. And among them was the prominent Egyptian-born Salafi, Abdul Rahman Abdul Khaliq. So this cleric, as you can see there, is a true transnational actor. So he was born in Egypt, where he received his early education. He then traveled to Saudi Arabia to study under prominent Saudi clerics, and later he settled in Kuwait. And Salafi clerics in Kuwait received their education from Saudi Arabia and are closely connected to Salafi clerics in both Saudi Arabia and in Egypt. And Kuwaiti Salafi clerics espouse similar views as the Egyptian and Saudi counterparts when addressing the so-called Shia threat. So the Kuwaiti Salafi scene is also fragmented and dynamic when it comes to the contestation within the Salafi circles, but this is beyond the scope of this talk, but I'm more than happy to discuss that later as well. So the Shia threat. Here, Salafi clerics in Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia demonstrate collective solidarity. The Iranian Revolution witnessed concerted efforts from the clerics in the three countries in Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, denouncing Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Iranian Revolution. And these ulama were of the conviction that the revolution was un-Islamic, not religious at all, and that Khomeini was removed from Islam. Arab Shia populations were also questioned and accused of treachery, and you have around 6 to 12% Shia population in Saudi Arabia. In Kuwait, you have a significant minority in Kuwait, and in Egypt, of course, as I've mentioned earlier, a very small minority. This condemnation continued as the clerics organized regional and international conferences. They endorsed each other's religious rulings, sermons and publications, and denounce Iran and Shia Twelvers in particular. There are other Shia sects, but the focus, particularly after the Iranian Revolution, was on Shia Twelvers, mainly because Iran champions Twelver Shiism. So these clerics or the ulama were transnational actors, mobilizing support for anti-Shia discourse. And the anti-Shia discourse has increased in frequency and intensity depending on the events in the region. For example, you will see more sermons, more lectures, more fatwas or religious rulings and publications following the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So there were more material on the treachery as well as the deviance of Shiism following the Iranian Revolution. Then you're also witnessing more publications, fatwas, as well as sermons following the Iraq sectarian war in 2006 to 2007. The Bahraini uprising, very similar in terms of the frequency as well as the magnitude of anti-Shia publications and so on. The Syrian civil war as well as the rise of the Houthis. Again, here you have concerted efforts by the Salafi clerics to denounce not only Shia theology and jurisprudence, but also Shia political activities. So they're also political actors in a way. However, these ulama, are not always on the same page when it comes to the Shia. So this is where you see a bit of diversity. In terms of theology, it can be safely argued that the Salafi doctrinal understanding of Shiism treats the Shia sect as at best deviant and at worst removed from Islam. And although a class of legitimate Shia is recognized, they often say that not all Shia are removed from Islam, but Salafi clerics do not distinguish these acceptable Shia as they remain elusive, mentioned in passing without proper identification. So when they issue a ruling, they would say that Shia are deviant, are removed from Islam, but not all of them. So that's their way of distinguishing, or at least making statements that they're not including all Shia. So when it comes to the positions of the clerics or Salafi ulama can be divided into two categories. And this is what I found as well in terms of their attitudes towards the Shia. Remember we talked about the three trends earlier, but that only applies to their relations with the state, but not when it comes to their attitudes towards the Shia. Here I've introduced two categories, traditionalist and progressive ulama. And when we look at progressive ulama, for instance, there are, so as I've said, they can be divided into two categories, traditionalist and progressive. And traditionalist ulama are those who refuse to engage with the Shia, and they have been classified as truly deviant, So they classify Shia as truly deviant. To them, the Shia are to be isolated. And because these ulama have never distinguished between the legitimate and deviant Shia, they often leave an impression that they target various Shia sects and populations. So the Grand Mufti, or the former Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, for example, stated that, I'm quoting him, Muslims should be prohibited from eating meat slaughtered by the Rafidas, a derogatory identification of the Shia, and should isolate them in the workplace. He similarly urged Muslims not to engage with such Rafida, so again, a derogatory identification of the Shia, including giving and replying salams, which means greetings. And this view is not only supported by other traditionalist ulama, but also publicized by them. So Kuwaiti clerics would publicize Ibn Baz's rulings, for instance, to demonstrate that they support that position. This is also the case of Egyptian clerics who also support that position. And politically, the traditionalist ulama question Shia sincerity. So we've looked at theology, but politically, they also question their sincerity. And for a very long time, these clerics have accused Arab Shia of disloyalty towards Kuwait, towards Iraq, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. They have also declared Iran as the enemy of Islam and Muslims. So another class of ulama are categorized as progressive, as I've mentioned earlier. And these ulama promote reconciliation and are willing to engage with some Shia communities, mainly the Shia in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Bahrain. They also avoid using or discussing Shia theology because they promote reconciliation and they're quite careful when analyzing Shia theology. One example is Salman al-Auda. You can see his picture there. He's in jail at the moment in Saudi Arabia. So he's a Saudi activist, and he works with Saudi Quietists when it comes to promoting reconciliation. So you can see there that typology doesn't quite work when it comes to understanding the attitudes of Salafi clerics towards the Shia. So you have Quietist and activist clerics working together and can be classified as progressive clerics. You also have activist clerics who are very aggressive in their approach towards the Shia, and they take the same position as the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, for instance, who can be classified as a Quietist cleric because they don't oppose the state. So Salman al-Auda, for example, delivered religious ruling or fatwa on the subject of dealing with the Shia. In the fatwa, he began by reminding Sunnis not to excommunicate Shia believers. He further explained the various sects that exist within Shiism, arguing that there are some Shia sects that are more extreme than the other sects. And he argued that in the event of encounter with a deviant Shia, The individual should be informed about authentic Islam, and he emphasized the need to be patient when confronting Shia believers, especially believers who engage in corrupt practices. But even then, he does not declare the infidelity. So you can see in terms of the polemical frequency and behavior of the ulama, they differ as well between the traditionalists as well as the progressive. And progressive ulama focus on offering political assessments of sectarian tensions in the region. So they don't use derogatory terms such as the Rafida to denounce the Shia and their political treachery. I mean, that's what the language used by traditionalist clerics. But they support reconciliation, often initiated by the state. So as for the Saudi Egyptian ulama, and I think this is really interesting because we've looked at the Saudis a little bit and Kuwaitis. What's really interesting about Egyptian ulama when it comes to the Shia, their rhetoric is generally uncompromising. And it doesn't matter if they belong to the activist or the quietist trend. When they deal with the Shia or the threat of the Rafida permeating Muslim societies, they're very vocal against the Shia. And this has been heightened following the proliferation of Salafi satellite channels in Egypt since 2005. The rhetoric is presented within the framework of the geopolitical circumstances of the region. And surprisingly, the internal Shia threat witnessed Salafi ulama in Egypt condemning Shiism theologically and politically. And Egyptian ulama, in collaboration with Saudi and Kuwaiti traditionalists of traditionalist leanings, portrayed Iran as intended to spread Shiism in Egypt. So they see this internal Shia threat and Iran as this an external power trying to convert Sunnis in Egypt to Shiism. So there's a photo there on that slide, Hassan al-Shahara. So he was a provocative Shia scholar who converted in 1996. In 2013, he was publicly lynched along with 5 of his followers in Cairo. It was really brutal what happened to him. And many blamed the Syrian Solidarity Conference organized in 2013, which Salafi clerics from Egypt, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia attended, including one of the prominent clerics, Muhammad al-Arifi, prominent Saudi cleric by the name of Muhammad al-Arifi. So the Syrian conference was organized to support Syrian Sunni co-religionists, but the rhetoric was so divisive. And as a result, many argued that Ash-Shahata was targeted by the mob just after the Syrian conference. So I'm looking at the final slide here. So in terms of understanding, to conclude the presentation. So here, the transnational, in conclusion, the transnational networks of clerics developed during Rashid Rida's time became dominant when the Salafi tradition, espoused by most Salafi clerics today, including Kuwaiti clerics, they are developed during Rashid Rida's time, and Rashid Rida played an important role. So these clerics endorse each other's views on the Shia threat through publications, educational and religious gatherings. And today, social media such as Twitter is also used to connect transnationally. Second, the clerics invest in targeting Shia detractors, and these efforts are transnational in nature, done through conferences, as you can see, the Syrian conference of 2013, done through social media, as well as Salafi satellite channels where Salafi clerics invite each other to speak on the Shia other. However, these clerics are also influenced by domestic circumstances. We've looked at Salman al-Auda, the Saudi cleric. Many argued that he realized the importance of interacting with the Shia population in Saudi Arabia, and therefore he became more tolerant towards the Shia. That's why we're classifying him as a progressive cleric. So many would argue it's because of the Shia domestic circumstances or Saudi domestic circumstances that compelled someone like al-Auda to cooperate with the Shia. And as demonstrated earlier, Egypt's domestic circumstances provided limited space for a more receptive approach towards the Shia in Egypt, as they remain, in the eyes of Egyptian clerics in Egypt, as an enigmatic deviant group. When you have only 100,000 Shia in the country, they're not, visible and therefore seen as this mysterious deviant group. And this perhaps explains the uniform hostility and the lack of reconciliatory rhetoric of the Salafi ulama in Egypt. So I've concluded. Basically, you have the two categories as well in terms of understanding the Shia clerics, the Salafi clerics towards the Shia, activist and progressive and traditionalist.
Thank you very much, Rehan. Thank you very much.